Kyle McCord versus Haynes King. Who do you got?
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, and we're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we are joined by Mike McAllister, who is the publisher of Syracuse on 24/7 Sports. We're going to talk about Kyle McCord versus Haynes King and who he would prefer, who I would prefer. But come on, we're Syracuse guys. You know what we're going to say to that. Or maybe we don't. I don't know what Mike is going to say, who he would rather. Then we're going to talk about Oronde Gadsden versus Eric Singleton of Georgia Tech, their top pass catcher versus our top pass catcher. Who do you got? And then the biggest key to success plus prediction time at the end. So stay tuned for that. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, Mike, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today. Let's start off with Haynes King and Kyle McCord. How do you think Kyle McCord versus Haynes King is going to go on Saturday?
Well, I think which one you prefer depends on what type of quarterback you'd like. Do you like a traditional pocket passer, sort of the sit in the pocket, pick you apart, and that type of a quarterback? If that's what you like, then Kyle McCord's your guy. If you like the gutty, gritty, not necessarily always pretty sort of Eric Dungy style of playing quarterback, just finds ways to win, then I think you like Haynes King. He's more mobile than what McCord is, but McCord is a better thrower of the football, turns it over less, better accuracy, better arm strength, all of that. If I'm picking, if this is like a fantasy draft situation and I got to pick one of the two quarterbacks, I'm going with Kyle McCord. He is a proven winner. He is 12-1 or 13-1, I think, at this point as a starting quarterback over the last 2 years. He had tremendous success at Ohio State, as is well documented. And yet in his first game at Syracuse, he set career highs in completions, passing yards, and passing touchdowns in a single game. I think the offense fits him well. I think he likes the weapons that he has, and they're clearly tailoring their play calling to his skill set. So if I'm picking one of the two, I'm picking Kyle McCord, but I think very highly of both quarterbacks, to be honest with you.
Well, it's funny the wording that you used because you mentioned like a fantasy draft. If we're talking fantasy football, I might go with Haynes King because I think Haynes King would score more fantasy points, to be fair, with his rushing ability and everything.
Yeah, he very well could. And it's the rushing, I think, that is where he separates himself there, because you get more points for rushing touchdowns and rushing yards than you do for passing yards and passing touchdowns. The caveat to that is, if Syracuse has a good game defensively and they can limit what he does through the air and keep him pedestrian on the ground, I think his floor is lower than what McCord's is, but perhaps his ceiling is higher because he could have a game where he dominates both through the air and on the ground. Whereas even if Kyle McCord is operating at peak efficiency and has a tremendous game, I don't think you're going to expect 60, 70, 80 rushing yards and a couple of rushing touchdowns from him. So, yeah, from a fantasy football standpoint, maybe McCord is a little bit safer, but Haynes King has the potential to be, the bigger boom for you.
I just want to also be clear that that was strictly like fantasy football talk, but in reality football, I would also take Kyle McCord because he's also a little less turnover prone.
Yes.
Okay? Kyle McCord is someone who doesn't throw a lot of interceptions. He almost threw one on the first drive of the game against Ohio, and then he did have the arm punt interception. But aside from that, he doesn't really put the ball in harm's way versus a guy like Haynes King. Yes, he does have that boom upside, but he also has the bust upside or downside, so to speak. Haynes King last year threw 16 interceptions for Georgia Tech. Now, I will give him credit. Last time I checked, I think Haynes King is completing over 70% of his passes to start this season, so he's off to a good start in that regard. But for now, I would lean towards Kyle McCord. I know this is a Syracuse podcast, so we're going to sound biased, but I still would take Kyle McCord over Haynes King. I said that in the preseason as well. Mike, I want to ask you this question because it sounds like one that would be super obvious. A quarterback influencing a game, but with the amount of rushing on both sides and the rushing defenses for both sides maybe not being so good, how much do you think the quarterbacks are actually going to influence this game?
I still think they're going to have a huge influence, and here's why. With Georgia Tech's rushing attack, Haynes King is very involved with that. Now, I believe he only has 80 rushing yards through the first 2 games, but they do call designed runs for him. And he can do a lot of read option that can put a lot of pressure on opposing defenses. So he's still going to be very involved, even if they run the ball 3/4 of the time. For Syracuse, even if they do run the ball quite a bit, we see a lot of LaQuint Allen, a lot of Yasin Willis. They're not going to run the ball exclusively. I still think Kyle McCord is going to get 20-plus passing attempts in this game. And they're going to try to do a lot of things off of that rushing attack, play action, situations like that. They could do some zone read. They could do some run pass options, some RPO. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Kyle McCord as well. But specifically, even if the rushing attack, even if LaQuint Allen is the primary focus of the offensive attack, there's still going to be plays for Kyle McCord to make. And even if he doesn't have as many attempts as he did last week, it's still imperative that he puts the ball where he needs to so that Syracuse can take advantage of those plays.
Very fair. I mean, obviously, quarterbacks are going to have a big influence on a game. I mean, usually, but it's just because of the rushing attacks on both sides. I think the biggest point you made there is the fact that Haynes King is such a big factor for Georgia Tech's rushing attack to begin with. It's like a two-headed monster with Haynes King, the quarterback, and Jamal Haynes, the running back. And I know a lot of people that are listening to this podcast might be Buffalo Bills fans. The way I would describe Haynes King is like a much toned-down version of Josh Allen. Like, he plays kind of like him. Think about Josh Allen. Big dude. He's got the biggest cannon in the world. He's going to throw the ball all over you. High upside, but, there is a little bit of a downside with Josh Allen, too. I think we can all acknowledge that, right? Bills fans, don't come at me. I mean, you've watched it over the last few years with him. But that's the way I describe Haynes King, which means he would still heavily influence a game. And I think for Syracuse, obviously, it's got to be the ball. The ball's got to be in Kyle McCord's hands.
Yeah.
Like, I think last week he proved it. Like, I know it's one game, but he proved it to me. Like,
well, and here's the good thing, too, from a Syracuse perspective, is that I think they went into that game expecting they'd be able to run the ball very well. And in the first half, they didn't run the ball very well. It seemed like every time they tried to run the ball, they'd get 2 yards, 3 yards, and they put themselves in a lot of third and medium situations.
And they couldn't get a lot of rhythm.
No, they couldn't, but
running.
They were able to rely on Kyle McCord to sort of get them into rhythm. And then once that got going, the running game came along in the second half. So even in a situation where Georgia Tech comes in and says, listen, we've been vulnerable against the run this year so far. We were vulnerable against the run most of last year. That's where teams really ate up against Georgia Tech. We're going to come into this game trying to take out LaQuint Allen and Yasin Willis and Will Nixon and making that our primary focus. Even if that's the primary focus of the Georgia Tech defense, there's still – you still have an opportunity from a Syracuse perspective to get into rhythm offensively, put up a lot of points because you can rely on Kyle McCord to carry your offense. And he showed that last week when the running game wasn't going very well and they couldn't do all of those play actions and things off of the ground game. They just dropped Kyle McCord back and said, pick the defense apart, and he was able to. And, the other thing about Georgia Tech this year is they have not been very good at pressuring the quarterback. They have one sack.
Yes, I did notice that.
And they don't have any interceptions. So I think that gives Syracuse an opportunity that even if the ground game does struggle, especially early, that they can still move the ball because they have a player like Kyle McCord who can direct the offense.
I think to your point, we've talked a lot about this Syracuse run defense over the past few days on the podcast, and it's been a big topic, obviously, because the run defense was not good.
It was not.
I don't know if we're talking much about this Georgia Tech defense. Like, are they really that good? Like, we saw Florida State against Boston College. Like, they're not a good team.
They're not.
So they did that against Florida State. Now I'm looking at it like,
was that really as impressive a defensive effort as perhaps it looked originally? And you look back on it and say, how do they give up 21 points to that team?
I don't know.
I mean, that's
I don't
the
know.
other part of it is the defense doesn't perhaps look as good as it did originally. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that win over Florida State wasn't still impressive. That was a huge win for Georgia Tech. It was.
Yeah, they had to win that game.
Yeah, and I came away from that game. I watched them against Georgia State, and I said, I think Georgia Tech is a legitimately good football team. I don't think anyone is here thinking that Georgia Tech is a juggernaut and unbeatable either. So, and
they're
you've
in
got
the top 25.
They are. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a huge game. I think it's a huge game for both teams because it feels like a swing game where each team can sort of gain momentum. Georgia Tech starts 2-0 in conference, and they have two of their more difficult conference games sort of out of the way, and they won both of those, neutral against Florida State and on the road at Syracuse. If Syracuse wins, you feel like, you just beat a ranked team. You start the conference play 1-0, and you're 2-0, and your first big game in the Dome under Fran Brown. I think you feel like you're off to a great start there. So it's a huge swing game for both teams. And I think both teams are good football teams based on what I saw the last couple of weeks.
That's a great tease for tomorrow's podcast that I'm going to do, which is who needs the game more? That's a great tease that you just put it. Who needs it more? My answer might surprise you, but I'm going to give that on tomorrow's podcast. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. We're joined by Mike McAllister, who is the publisher of Syracuse on 24/7 Sports. We just broke down Kyle McCord versus Haynes King. I know this is a Syracuse podcast, but of course, we're going to take Kyle McCord over Haynes King. Now let's talk about a pair of weapons on both sides. We obviously have Oronde Gadsden, the All-American tight end. They have Eric Singleton, who is one of the better receivers in the ACC. He's off to a little bit of a slow start. Eric Singleton has 6 catches for barely above 60 yards, and I believe a touchdown. So it's not going to be about shutting down Eric Singleton. Mike, what I'm going to ask you is, how can Syracuse keep Singleton staying neutralized?
Well, I think the biggest thing is when you look at Georgia Tech's receivers, him and the guy Malik Rutherford is actually their leading receiver right now with 11 catches, almost 200 yards, and a touchdown so far. Those two guys are 5'9" and 5'11". Now, they've got Avery Boyd, who's kind of their third wide receiver, who's about 6'3". They've got Chase Lane, who's about 6 foot. But, neither of those guys are primary focuses of the offensive attack. Rutherford and Singleton are the top 2 guys. Neither of them are very big in stature. So I think that gives Syracuse, with the length that it has at corner, to really be physical with those guys and to disrupt their timing with their length, with their physicality. That's the biggest thing is, of course, you want to have a pass rush. And we saw one of the more encouraging things from the defense last week was that they had 4 sacks against Ohio. Fadil Diggs,
2 of them.
Yes, he's I think I tweeted out after his second one, Diggs is good at football. That's my expert analysis on that one. And he is. He's awesome. This is a game where he could have a huge impact. Obviously, getting pressure on Haynes King is huge. That disrupts the timing from that standpoint. But even if you don't, the defensive backs have an opportunity to get their hands on the Georgia Tech wide receivers, be physical with them, get them off of their route. Don't make their first step be as easy as they want it to be, and disrupt timing from that perspective. So that's kind of where I look at it, is I think Syracuse has a size advantage there when you're looking at Georgia Tech's skill position players offensively versus Syracuse's skill position players defensively. That's something that could play into Syracuse's advantage. Otherwise, it's being smart. The first, I'd say about 3/4 of the game against Ohio, I thought the coverage by the Syracuse defense was pretty good. Yeah, they were on top of Ohio's receivers. I know Georgia Tech receivers are significantly more talented, but we go with what we've seen so far. I thought they showed good coverage skills, good instincts, tackled almost immediately after the catch. And then as the fourth quarter went along, they kind of got a little bit softer. And I think part of that was, sort of playing prevent and trying to prevent the big play.
I almost discount that. I just kind of throw that away. Like, it's soft zone. I mean, we saw DJ for Florida State end up with 270 yards passing. Like, how's that even possible?
And no one thought he had
it's garbage time.
Yeah, nobody thought he had I called for him to be benched midway through the game. So the point is, I think there's an opportunity here for Syracuse to blanket those wide receivers. Now, Georgia Tech is going to be more sophisticated in terms of the routes that it runs. They're going to be more deliberate in terms of trying to get their receivers the ball. Ohio really wanted to rely on the running game and be really physical up front. Georgia Tech, of course, wants to run the ball, but it's going to be a little bit of a different approach because they want to get the ball into the hands of those two players, Rutherford and Singleton, to try to allow them to make plays in space. So from Syracuse perspective, use the length to your advantage, get your hands on them at the line of scrimmage, be smart and disciplined. And then once they get the ball, get them down. They're going to complete some passes. They're going to get some first downs. Don't let the 12-yard play turn into a 35-yard play. Don't let the 3-yard pass on 3rd and 10 turn into a 15-yard gain and first down and keeping a drive alive. Those are the things that I think Syracuse has to focus on in this game.
And we saw Syracuse pick up a 3rd and 13 with Trevor Pena, where he caught the ball about 7 yards behind the line to gain and was able to run for a first down. I know Ohio's defense in that it was great blocking on Syracuse's end, but you have to be able to shed those blocks. Like at the end of the day, you just have to, when you have that much time to be able to shed a block before the line to gain, you just have to do it. So that's a big key for Syracuse. I do want to give credit, though, to the Georgia Tech secondary, because obviously Oronde Gadsden is going to be a big factor in the game plan. He's always going to be a big factor in the game plan. He's the best weapon that Syracuse has.
No question.
Georgia Tech has not allowed a single pass catcher this season yet. It's been 8 quarters to go over 70 yards in a game. Think about that for a second. Not a single one.
Yeah. That's impressive, especially when you consider the fact that Georgia State was trailing by multiple scores for most of that game. And so they were basically throwing the ball almost the entire second half. Now, that said, Florida State, most of their success that they had against Georgia Tech, they were really trying to pound the ball. They were trying to run the ball at Georgia Tech because Georgia Tech struggled with that last year.
And they struggled against Georgia State, I think. I think they gave up 150 yards rushing to Georgia State, and Georgia State lost by like 3 touchdowns.
Yes. And Georgia State did run the ball well early, and there was a point early in the second half where it seemed like there was a chance for Georgia State to get back in the game, but never really materialized. That said, that plays a part of it as well, how teams attacked them, but that's still a factual statement. No one has had over 70 receiving yards against that secondary, even though they don't have any interceptions, even though they only have 1 sack in 2 games. That says that, they've got some guys back there that can cover a little bit. So, even though Syracuse has a lot of weapons, they've got Haynes. Jackson Meeks made an unbelievable catch last week against Ohio. Yep. They've got Oronde Gadsden, as we noted. We didn't even see them throw the ball to Dan Villari. LaQuint Allen made a one-handed catch. Trevor Pena, shout out to that kid for coming back and having the game of his life in his first game back from injury.
I'm a buyer in Trevor Pena, by the way.
Me too. I'm
a believer.
He was fantastic. So they've got a lot of weapons offensively that they can throw the ball to. So it's going to be a little bit different from a Georgia Tech perspective, because this is going to be a significant upgrade in terms of a passing attack than what they played against Florida State, who has a quarterback that seems to just like to check the ball down, doesn't really try to push the ball downfield, and struggles with decision-making and all those things we've seen the first 2 weeks. And a Georgia State team that's talent-wise just not at the same level as a Florida State or a Syracuse. So I think this is going to be the most difficult test for that Georgia Tech secondary. But certainly so far through 2 games, it's hard to really find fault in anything that they've done.
Yeah, they look good in that area. That's why I wanted to point out that stat, that they have not allowed a receiver to go over 70 yards. But you mentioned the lack of pressure that they typically have, or that, 1 sack in 2 games. I know that sacks are not everything, but if you only have 1 sack in 2 games, you're probably not getting a lot of pressure on the quarterback, because if you get more pressures, you're going to get sacks. It's just how it works. So the key really is it's not obviously the offensive line and everything, but it's to get open. the receivers just have to get open, because you have to figure that the offensive line is going to be able to hold up against this Georgia Tech front. Now it's about the receivers being able to create separation, and guys like Oronde Gadsden obviously being the main catalyst of it. If you had to say, is there any X factor that you think is going to play a big role for Syracuse or Georgia Tech on the skill position wise?
I'm wondering if this is a game where we see Zeed Haynes break out a little bit. I was almost expecting early in the game they take a deep shot to him to try to get the crowd into it and sort of make a statement early in the game and get the Fran Brown era off to a huge start, something like that. That never really materialized. They didn't really throw the ball downfield to him. And I'm wondering if that was by design, because Zeed Haynes has blazing speed. He is as fast as it gets in the ACC at the wide receiver position. And I think there's an opportunity to try to stretch the field with him a little bit. So when you've got a guy like Trevor Pena, who just had a fantastic game, as we mentioned, you've got a guy like Oronde Gadsden, who's going to put a ton of pressure on opposing defenses. They're going to be focusing so much on those guys. If you can now get Zeed Haynes one-on-one a couple of times and take some deep shots, we know Kyle McCord is extremely accurate down the field. I think there's an opportunity for some big plays there. So that's something that I look at. But the other part of it is, you mentioned the Syracuse offensive line. There were a few occasions against Ohio where Ohio did get some pressure on Kyle McCord. And I think Georgia Tech's athletes at the defensive line, even though they haven't put a ton of pressure on either Georgia State or Florida State, their athletes are better than what Syracuse saw against Ohio.
Yeah.
So how well Syracuse can hold up, specifically those tackles, the two transfer tackles, Demetrius Weatherspoon and Savion Washington, how do they hold up against a front line that is, they understand what Syracuse's weapons are. So they're going to try to be getting to McCord as quickly as possible so that he doesn't have time to read the field and find any of those weapons. So I'm really interested. I think those are the two X factors. Can they get Zeed Haynes one-on-one down the field, and then how those tackles hold up against Georgia Tech?
Well, another key, it goes back to, it's like yin and yang with an offense. You want to stop a blitz, run the ball.
That's right.
There you go. Run the ball. If you can
that
run the ball,
down a pass rush as well as anything.
Running the ball, honestly, in football, it changes everything if your team can run the ball. Like, unless you have Patrick Mahomes, you have to be able to run the ball.
Have to.
Like, even the Chiefs need to run the ball with Isaiah Pacheco at times. Like, you have to run the football. So, hey, run the ball. And they run the ball, good things are going to happen. It's going to open up that pass game. All of a sudden, everyone's kind of creep in. You throw it over the top to a guy like Zeed Haynes. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV-based plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Syracuse football faces Georgia Tech this Saturday at noon, and the Orange are 2.5-point underdogs. Will Fran Brown and company pull off the upset? You can bet it right now on FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. We're joined by Mike McAllister, who is the publisher of Syracuse on 24/7 Sports. We talked about Kyle McCord and Haynes King, all the weapons in this day, mainly Oronde Gadsden, Eric Singleton, and all those fellas over there. Biggest key to success. Mike, what is the biggest key to success for Syracuse in this game?
I think it's pretty simple. Syracuse has to stop the run. That's, we talk about all these other things. They're all important. There's no one thing that this is the only thing you have to worry about, and then that will determine the game, because there's, everything sort of is predicated on everything else. But the one area I want to see improvement, they say that the biggest improvement is week 1 to week 2, is Syracuse's ability to stop the run. I think everyone was surprised with how easily it seemed that Ohio ran the ball against Syracuse.
Listen, Mike, I'm going to cut you off here. They had Eric Dickerson in the backfield.
Right. It seemed that way. And, I thought Ohio blew multiple opportunities to try to really put game pressure on Syracuse by getting inside the 10-yard line and then seeming to stop running the ball. They did that 2 or 3 times down there. And that played, I think, to Syracuse's favor. But that aside, there were, I think, multiple opportunities with some of those longer runs that Ohio had, where Syracuse had a guy in place to make a play, took a bad angle. There was one play in particular where Justin Barron had, I think it was Tyus, had him, sort of one-on-one in the outside. And even though he had help to his inside, when Tyus made a cut to fake inside, Barron bought it. He then cut inside as well. Then Tyus went outside and went around him. Whereas if he relied on his inside contain and stayed planted where he was and kept shading outside, instead of a 25, 30-yard gain, that's, maybe a 3-4 yard gain. So there's multiple opportunities for Syracuse to improve in that area. They missed a lot of tackles. Fran Brown talked about the lack of physicality from the front, and I think they'll correct that. The other side of it is they did have 10 tackles for loss in that game. So
it's a very weird game.
It really was. It seemed like they were either getting 25, 30 yards or they were losing 3. I mean, it was very odd in a lot of ways. But so I think you saw some glimpses. There was a 3rd and 1 situation where Ohio lined up and ran the ball right at Syracuse, because they had been all game, and Syracuse stopped them for a 2-yard loss and forced a punt. And then next possession, Ohio would run the ball 3 times and score. So it was very odd. But I think there is at least some hope that they can be significantly better. I'm not saying come out and hold Georgia Tech to 2 yards a carry and 40 yards rushing, but don't let them get 250 to 300 like Boston College did against Florida State either. Maybe keep them around 100 to 120, and then that plays to your benefit. That's the biggest thing for me from a Syracuse perspective, is you cannot let the Georgia Tech ground game dictate the entire flow of the game, because if they do, I think they're going to win.
Fair enough. I would actually set the bar at 150. I think if you get
I'd be okay with that.
And that's a big number. But if you can hold them to 150 or lower with Syracuse's offense, like in the past, I don't think Syracuse's offense would have been able to overcome that. But I believe in our offense. I believe in Kyle McCord. I believe in the weapons that they have. And I think the offensive line can hold up. So as long as you can let them run, but don't let them run wild. So don't cross the 150-yard mark. I'm going to be a little bit more specific with my biggest key. Red zone defense. How about that? Because one of the unsung, I haven't really talked about this a lot, but it was the very beginning of the game. First 2 drives for Ohio, I believe they got into the red zone. And one of the reasons why maybe we didn't panic as much about the game is because Syracuse stiffened in the red zone and forced them to field goals. And I know it sounds really basic, but against a team like Georgia Tech that's going to run the ball and they're going to chew the clock, because that's what happens when you're running the ball. The clock is going to keep running. You have to be able to hold them to field goals to give your offense a chance to be able to outscore your opponent. Syracuse had 1 drive in the first quarter against Ohio. 1. That was it. And it was a 3-and-out. But guess what? They were only down 6-0. They could have been down 14-0, but they were only down 6. And that's because of the red zone defense. So my biggest key is they're going to get yards. It's going to happen. Georgia Tech's a good football team. We have to respect that. So can they hold them to field goals instead of touchdowns to give our offense a chance to be able to catch up on them? Mike, before I let you go and ask you a score prediction, it's a fill-in-the-blank game. Syracuse wins if?
Syracuse wins if they hold Georgia Tech to under 4 yards a carry. If they do that, the 3.5, something like that. And here's the part that helps that stat is when you sack the opposing quarterback, it comes off of their rushing yards. So if you sack Haynes King 2 or 3 times, he loses 15, 20 yards on those 3 sacks, then, that's 20 yards less rushing than perhaps they have if you just take the running backs numbers. So that's the one thing, it goes right back to the run defense. So I think if Syracuse holds Georgia Tech's rushing attack to under 4 yards carry, I think they come out with a W.
Okay, and Mike, on the flip side, Georgia Tech wins if.
To pick something different, because I could just say they average over 4 yards,
Yes, you have to pick something different. That's the point
Yeah,
of the exercise.
we'll pick something different. If Georgia Tech wins the turnover battle,
Okay.
Turnovers weren't a huge factor in the game against Ohio.
Yeah, it was one aside.
Yeah, one aside, and maybe Syracuse should have had to with the Deuce Chestnut interception. And Kyle McCord's was kind of essentially a punt. So I'm not sure I really fault him for that one, which also came after a bogus holding call that would have put Syracuse first and goal to 2. That aside, we'll save my ref suck discussion for another time. I think turnovers in a game like this where it's such a huge game, as we mentioned, Georgia Tech's coming in ranked. They're 2-0. They're feeling extremely confident. Syracuse is still getting their feet wet a little bit, but they feel pretty good about getting a win in week 1. We've got all these other things going on. When you're a road team going into a hostile environment, even if you're the favorite, one of the ways that you do win in a tough road environment is by winning the turnover battle and taking care of the football yourself. I think Georgia Tech, if they're able to run the ball, but don't turn it over either in Syracuse territory when they look like they're going in to score or giving Syracuse's offense a short field, that plays significantly to their advantage. On the flip side, if they can turn Syracuse's offense over, that gets their defense off the field and puts the ball back in the hands of that offense that has been pretty good through 2 weeks.
All right, Mike, score prediction time.
I'm going to take Syracuse strictly because they're at home. If this game was being played at Georgia Tech, I would pick them. And I'm looking at a 1-possession game. I think this is going to go right down to the wire. This could be a situation where Syracuse has a lead and is trying to protect it and has to stop Georgia Tech in the last couple of minutes, or vice versa. They have to go down and score in order to pull off a victory. I'm going to take Syracuse 31, Georgia Tech 27.
All right. I'm going to save my prediction for later in the week. So you're going to have to stay tuned to Locked On Syracuse to figure out what I'm going to say. But I think people might have an idea. If you want a hint, go take a look at what I said in the preseason of the wins and losses on Syracuse's schedule. I haven't changed it. All right. So that's Mike McAllister. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this video, click that like button. And if you really liked it, subscribe to the channel, turn on those notifications so you know right away when I am dropping the next podcast, which, by the way, I teased earlier in the episode, Who Needs the Game More? That is coming tomorrow. Take care, everyone.